Someone shared a link on social media about a 30 million year old praying mantis fossil that was found encased in amber just like the mosquitoes in Jurassic Park. And many of the comments on that post were from science deniers, noting that a praying mantis is still a praying mantis 30 million years later. As if it's supposed to turn into something else. Because remember, the creationists' misunderstanding of evolution is bewildering. Deliberately so. It has to be, in order to maintain the carefully cultivated confusion on which their faith depends. In that thread, they said they believe in adaptation, but not in evolution, not realizing that adaptation is defined as evolution under the influence of natural selection. And of course, they think that a scientific theory is just a blind guess, like their own position is, and they bought into the very first foundational falsehood of creationism, which is that they think that you have to reject God in order to accept the science. Because when you're limited to binary thinking, then it's all or nothing, black or white, no gray, no scales or degrees, no nuance, no in-between. Remember also that these people say that a transitional species means one that is incomplete, like not finished being made, malformed, so that it can't live on its own. This is the kind of stupidity one can expect only from people who are trying that hard to get it all wrong in their own minds, on purpose, so that they don't have to worry about it making sense to them. Because for some of these religious extremists, evolution is forbidden knowledge, so they have to distort it into something absurd to avoid the risk of understanding it. And one of the folks in this thread thought that evolution taught that we were once fish, and then monkeys, and then birds, and then human. So yeah, these are phenomenally stupid people. I can't even call them trolls anymore because I live in the U.S., and in both urban and rural areas, I have personally met way too many people who really are that damn dumb. One of the many problems with the lack of perception that religious fundamentalists have, aside from the fact that they are willfully ignorant and that their faith is literally stupefying, is that their concept has no depth. Ancient history may as well have occurred last Thursday. So there's no point in trying to explain a taxonomic hierarchy of multiple levels of several species within a genus, different genera within a family, a few families within an order, and so on. No. All believers know is species, and they don't know what a species is. In that thread, for example, someone listed what they thought were species called fish, monkey, and bird. Each of those is a collection of hundreds of species at least, if not thousands. Even the Bible authors figured out that birds are not a single species. The Bible says that there are all sorts of birds of different kinds. Now, there's a taxonomic hierarchy right there. Kinds within sorts. There are like 18,000 species of birds in the world today, to say nothing of all the fossil forms, which are not the same species that we have today, none of them. So, of course, these people also thought that the praying mantis is a single species, and that it hasn't had much evolution in 30 million years. It's hardly changed in all that time. But mantis is not a species, nor is it a genus, nor even a family. It's a taxonomic order consisting of 29 families, branching into myriad genera and thousands of species, all from one common ancestor. That is where the evolution is. The science deniers think that evolution means one thing, often an individual, turning into or giving birth to another fundamentally different kind of thing, something so different from its parents that they're not even related anymore. That's obviously completely wrong. That's a strawman distortion, not even remotely like evolution at all. But that is why the wanna believers expect a mantis to change into something completely different, such that it's not a mantis anymore. They don't understand that evolution is not transformation nor metamorphosis. It's biodiversity, for which evolution provides the only explanation, scientific or otherwise. Creationism doesn't even pretend to account for the origin of new species in the lab or in agriculture or livestock cultivation or anywhere else. Darwin explained that. Jesus never even tried to. Muhammad didn't either, because these alleged prophets of God didn't know anything about biology or paleontology or genetics. I don't expect creationists to watch this video. They won't. They're afraid of learning. But I want you to understand why they say the stupid things that they do and what the facts of the matter really are. Evolution is and means that because of subtle variations in every individual ever born, then one original population eventually becomes two or more phenotypically and genotypically distinct ones, and those two go on to become 4 and then 8, 16, and so on, with each new subset becoming increasingly distinct from their ancestors or cousins, excepting, of course, for those that eventually go extinct. That's how they diversify to the point that they end up being classified in a different genus or family. It is never one thing changing into a completely different kind of thing, like they like to try to pretend. When I do videos explaining phylogeny, they are typically in 2 phases. How the selected form developed in the first place, how they came to be, and then how they subsequently diversified. But not this time. I need to keep this one concise. 1 episode only. So let's look at the evolution of the mantis. Studies of comparative genetics set against the molecular clock of average mutation rates indicate that their lineage diverged from ours around about 670 million years ago. I covered many of the specifics of early protorostome and arthropod evolution in the first episode of my series on Arachnomorpha. I don't want to repeat all of that here, so I'll just put up a link to that below and try to pick up with the emergence of insects or their divergence from other arthropods roughly 440 million years ago. Homeobox genes govern body segmentation differently in arthropods than in most other animals, with a chain of duplicated body segments. These are most obvious in the many segments of myriapods, centipedes, and millipedes. However, any of these segments are subject to change by mutation, such that what was once a leg, for example, can now perform a different function, as pinchers perhaps. In this illustration, the red parts are antennae, and the green parts are walking legs. The purple parts are manipulators. In chelicerates, that would be their chelicerae, which in spiders are their fangs. And on centipedes, they have venom-injecting claws. On decapods, which include crabs and lobsters, it will become pinching claws. But as you can see, this segment was lost in insects, along with a couple others too. Some of these segments can be deleted, or they may fuse together, so that on 6-legged hexapods, antennae, mandibles, and maxilla will all end up on one fused segment called the head, while the legs all extend from a thorax, another fused segment, and the remaining segments will form the abdomen, which is still visibly segmented on many insects. Or, with 8-legged chelicerates, mouth parts and pedipalps, as well as all the legs, will be attached to a cephalothorax, being the head and thorax fused together, while the abdomen often remains segmented, except for some, like spiders, of course. Decapods, the 10-legged lobsters and crabs, have their claws and legs and their mouth parts all fused onto a cephalothorax as well, while the abdominal part remains segmented. Even in crabs, who start out like lobsters with tails, but as they mature, their tails turn inward and fuse into their carapace, so that all embryological segments end up being one unit. Spiders are a subset of the subphylum Chelicerae, and decapods are a subset of another subphylum, crustaceans. They are not as closely related as this illustration might seem to imply. We're only comparing similarities in some of the individuals from each of these groups on their development. Their true relationship looks more like this, where insects are more closely related to crustaceans than they are to spiders or centipedes. So this gets us to hexapods, those with 6 legs and 3 body segments, head, thorax, and abdomen. The most basal of these are the entonates, like springtails, and in particular proturans, also known as coneheads. Entonates are considered a paraphyletic group because they are apparently ancestral to true insects, but the category does not include insects. Well, the category includes springtails, and they used to be considered insects, but it was later determined that they're not quite the same thing, because they developed their 3 body segments, head, thorax, and abdomen, independent of insects. So it turns out that that configuration is a convergent coincidence. Thus, some corrections were needed at the base of hexapoda to keep that cladogram consistent. But that explains why diplurans, an intermediate form, don't have the 3-segmented body plan. Notice, each pair of legs sprouts from its own separate segment. Still, they are one step closer to insects, sporting a pair of caudal appendages called cerci that grow out of the 10th abdominal segment. Many insects have cerci as well, developing the same way, and they use these either as weapons or like sensors, though some insects don't use them for anything at all. I should note that diplurans are unusually small, even for insects, and they spend most of their lives underground. So if they ever had eyes, they didn't need them anymore. Entonaths are blind. They can feel sunlight, but they don't like it. So they run and hide from it underground. Entonatha means that they still have the primitive or prior ability to chew their food inside their mouths like we do. Ectonaths, otherwise known as insects, lost that ability, losing those internal mouth parts like teeth, and consequently they can only chop and grate their food up with mandible and maxillae, which are positioned just outside of their mouths. And some science denialists will say that a loss of traits cannot be evolution, but the result in this case is the largest class of arthropods. Theirs is a more prolific and, in evolutionary terms, a more successful taxonomic class than ours is. Class Mammalia cannot compete or even compare. There are mere subsets of insects, like ants or beetles, that have more species than any other taxonomic class. Oh, but it's still an ant after millions of years. How come it ain't ever evolved? They evolved into 78 distinct genera and nearly 800 species, just in the United States alone. On the global scale, experts say there are over 20,000 species. Not of insects in general, no, just ants. One common ancestral species becomes 2, then those 2 become 4, then those 4 become 8, then 16 and 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, and on to eventually over 20,000 species of ants from one original species. And that's just the ones that are alive today. We're not even counting the ones that went extinct along the way. And beetles have diversified into more species than every other class of animals combined. There are 400,000 species of beetles. That's evolution. So we start with the basal form that lost its teeth, becoming something like archaeonaths, also known as jumping bristletails. They first appeared in the fossil record in the Devonian period of the Paleozoic era, around 390 million years ago. Their name implies that they are the oldest and most primitive group, but they're really not, or not by much. It's actually their sister group, Zygontoma, which consists of silverfish and firebrats. They appear in the fossil record around 400 million years ago. The science deniers ignore biodiversity entirely, focusing instead on a single lineage changing from one thing into another. So they say that for evolution to happen, the new form has to take over while the old form dies out. But the reality of evolution as an explanation of biodiversity is that despite the volume of ants that we just mentioned, there are still over 500 species of archaeonaths and 550 species of zygontomes, and none of them are endangered. Now we get to Pterygota, insects that can do what no other arthropod can do, that no other proterostome can do. 50 million years ago, after the demise of the dinosaurs, bats adapted their forelimbs into wings for flight. But 100 million years before bats, one lineage of Menaraptoran dinosaurs did the same thing to become birds. Roughly 80 million years before birds, pterosaurs modified their forelimbs in a similar fashion to become the first vertebrates to take flight. However, nearly 100 million years before pterosaurs, insects had already taken flight, and they flew alone for all that time. The exact specifications for how this happened is not as obvious as it is in bats and birds and pterosaurs, all modifying their forelimbs the way they did. Insects got their wings another way. The fossil record can't account for this, partly because this stage of their evolution happened in the Carboniferous period, when, precisely because it was the Carboniferous, the places where these insects lived rarely ever permit fossilization. But there could be no fossil that would show us this type of development anyway. Even if we found a gliding bug with half-sized wings, that wouldn't tell us how they came about. The oldest flying insects in the fossil record look like the most primitive insects alive today. They begin their lives as underwater nymphs. They don't have wings at that stage, but they do have gills that look an awful lot like their wings will. Their gills are even able to flap, though not quite the same way as wings do. It's not that an insect's wings are just modified gills. It's more complicated than that, but I'll try to keep it as simple as I possibly can. Remember how insects develop biologically from an embryo, by a chain of repeated segments. some of which code differently, and any of which can be modified by mutation or fused with another segment to develop in a different place. Early experiments in genetics showed how mutations in these segments could cause a leg to grow out of a fruit fly's face where an antenna should have been. So it's possible to grow a gill out of the wrong place or in a slightly different configuration. It's also possible to produce novel structures or modify existing structures into novel forms. For the last 100 years, scientists have been leaning in this direction with no way to know which is the case. But a study in 2020 out of the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, claims to have finally solved this issue. That study reports that the phenotypes for the knockout of 5 leg patterning genes in crustaceans who have gills in their legs, as compared with matching genes in flying insects, leading to an alignment of insect and crustacean legs that suggests that 2 leg segments that are found in the common ancestor of insects and crustaceans were incorporated into the insect body wall, moving the proximal leg site of the leg dorsally up onto the back to later form insect wings, suggesting that insects' wings are not entirely novel structures but have instead evolved from existing and formerly vestigial ancestral structures from a mutation or series of mutations that cost the insects 2 pairs of their legs but eventually compensated them with 2 pairs of wings, or with 1 pair of wings shielded by a wing-like carapace. Science-denying religious fundamentalists don't like it when scientists use terms like suggests, meaning that this is what the evidence indicates. They don't understand that science is an investigation, not a belief. We're not married to a particular conclusion, but we must bow to the facts in evidence and change our minds when necessary, even if we had a pet theory that we really liked, to see it disproved. Believers don't care about any of that because they are, by definition, holding onto a belief system where they are trying to convince themselves of things that are not evidently true. And they like to pretend as if the scientists are doing the same thing. That's why the wanna-believers say that everything they want to pretend is 100% absolutely proven certain fact, even when it's only baseless speculation and already disproved because all the actual facts are against it. Creationists can say any fool thing they want and be refuted all day, every day, because they have neither honor nor shame. But scientists have to worry about their credibility. What you say today better be verifiably accurate because it will be tested, and it better still be correct tomorrow, too, even in light of new information. So be careful how you phrase whatever you say. The first flying insects were evidently herbivorous, able to eat of leaves that were high in the trees that were hard for anything else to get to. And remember that at that time, these were the only animals that could fly. But of course, evolution means one original set of flying insects become 2 distinct ones, where a similar-looking sister set became carnivorous and began hunting the other ones. The griffin flies of the Carboniferous 300 million years ago were similar to today's dragonflies, except of course that some of them were as big as falcons or hawks. And one issue that they had is that they were rather like helicopters, both in superficial appearance and also in that their wings required so much room that their legs were still good for landing gear or for grasping prey, but it's awkward trying to get around on the ground with those big wings spread out like that. Like helicopters, they mostly sat where they landed and had to take off again from there. And they didn't move to different places in the airport the way airplanes do. Those are Paleoptera, and now we're getting into Neoptera, where their wings can fold back into a walking position. That's convenient. And notice that the new form exists alongside the old one, because the old ones can still do what they do just fine. It's just that the new ones can do something else now, too. From there, we have a choice of 2 paths. The vast majority of insect species are in Eumetabola, but we're only chasing one particular subset, and they're in the sister group, Polyneoptera. These do not have a pupae stage. They don't hatch as larvae that eat and fatten up until it's ready to cocoon and complete its development, like other insects, like butterflies and other flies. Polyneopterans are born already looking like tiny adults. Let's look at some of the sister sets here. First, we have angelflies, which is a weird name because most of them don't have wings, or they don't have wings very long. Some insects only use their wings for migration or for mating or for distributing their eggs, and then they lose them. Angelflies can shed their wings with their old skin and not grow them back. Then we have Dermoptera, better known as earwigs. You might think these all look pretty much the same, but there are a couple thousand species of these things. They still have wings, but they're vestigial, meaning that they're reduced in size to the point that they have diminished capacity or no capacity in their original function. So they have these pathetically little wings that they can't use for flying anymore. Next up are stoneflies, with 3,500 species worldwide. They are considered the most primitive of the neopterans, being visibly similar to fossil predecessors dating back to the beginning of the Permian period, just less than 300 million years ago. They're not strong flyers. Some don't even have wings, yet those that do still prefer to get around on the ground, except of course for means of procreation. Stoneflies are much more diverse than earwigs. Some can and do fly, others prefer to live underwater all their lives, and some look a bit like grasshoppers. Some look demonic. Some look like professional wrestlers in their colorful costumes. I think I ate a bowl of this once with rice and an extremely spicy vindaloo sauce. Some of these look like flying ants, and some of them look like cockroaches. Remember that because we're going to come back to it in a moment. It's easy to see how a simple form like this could have evolved into each of these other groups, including the next side group, Orthoptera. 20,000 species of grasshoppers and crickets and associated forms, all descending from a common ancestral population that looked a bit like a particular subset of stoneflies, but one that grew oversized hind legs. The next few clades show how we're getting closer to mantids. Gryloblattidae are almost there. They look like wingless cockroaches. And what is cool about them, literally, is that they're extremophiles, living on North American mountaintops and along glaciers. They live in a colder climate than most other insects can even function in. But if the weather gets warmer than the inside of your refrigerator, they'll die. They think 50 degrees Fahrenheit is a heat wave. These are in the order Notera, which literally means no wings. A sister set of the same order is Mantophasmatidae. To me, they look like a weird blend of grasshopper and mantis. The next clade over is Phasmatoidea, what we as kids used to call walking sticks, although some count as walking leaves. They appeared in the lower Cretaceous period 126 million years ago, and they evolved into 3,000 species today. Finally, Ambioptera, commonly known as web spinners, because they live in homespun silk. But they look like earwigs. They appeared in the Upper Jurassic 160 million years ago, and there are about 400 species of them today. But the clade we're focusing on today is a group of insects who have a flexible neck. Dictyoptera is a taxonomic superorder best known as the clade of cockroaches, and also of mantids. Predecessors, known as roachoids, appear in the Carboniferous period around 320 million years ago, while true roaches don't appear in the fossil record until the late Jurassic around 130 million years ago. That's 100 million years before our mantis in amber. Evolutionary theory says that mantises are actually much older than that fossil implies. The molecular clock pushes this divergence even further, suggesting that crown Dictyoptera and stem mantises date back to the late Carboniferous, some 300 million years ago. But crown mantises, however, would be much more recent, appearing roughly 200 million years ago at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. Whatever the time frame, Dictyoptera began before mantises did, and the ancestors of crown mantids were stem roaches. In fact, apart from the fact that the mantis has a slightly longer neck and slightly more modified front limbs, the primary difference between mantids and roaches is just a matter of posture. Oh, they say evolution between taxonomic orders is impossible. Too much new information in the genome. They're supposedly completely different kinds at that level. But the descendants of this form evolved into 7,300 species of cockroaches, and then into a couple thousand species of termites as well, while the spawn of this form evolved into 2,400 species of praying mantis. This video is so long already, which is a pity, because this is where mantis evolution begins. This chart starts with unclassified fossil forms, which is not the right way to do it, because it literally ignores everything that ever lived in the last 100 million years, including our amber mantis from 30 million years ago, and puts them all in one box of dead things, separate from the new ones alive today. Then the chart moves into a number of different superfamilies. Remember that these links are not individual species. Superfamilies means that they're a collection of different families that cannot interbreed with each other because they're different kinds of mantises. Each family usually contains more than one genus, and each genus typically has multiple species. If we explored all of these, showing pics of every species in this whole clade, that might be a fair illustration of what evolution looks like.